Hey guys, and welcome to my complete Jackal guide. In this video, we will be going over NIKKE's newest SSR character, which is JACKAL. She is a burst type 2 defender that can give your team surprisingly effective buffs by increasing your team's damage output and applying debuffs on your enemies. I will be explaining how JACKAL's abilities work, talk about how good I think she is as a support, go over her best character synergies, and basically everything you need to know about this character. To start things off, we will go over how JACKAL's burst actually works, because I feel like this is the most important yet the most complicated part of her kit. Essentially, JACKAL's burst increases your whole team's burst skill damage to a single enemy by 38.91% at level 10, and this effect will last for 15 seconds. On top of that, this will also increase your team's defense by 14.69%. The first part of this skill is actually not as simple as it seems, so let me break it all down for you and answer some of the questions that you may have. Basically, JACKAL's burst skill damage buff will only apply if your character has a burst that only deals one instance of damage to a single target. So you are looking at characters like Helm, Novel, and Dala. With that said, there are a few exemptions. There are some skills that deal a single instance of damage to a single target, but it won't get the buff from JACKAL's burst. I'm talking about characters like Snow White and Maxwell. Their burst only deals one instance of damage to a single target, but it is not getting amplified by JACKAL's buff. The reason for this is after Snow White or Maxwell uses their burst, the attack will be considered as a normal attack, not a burst skill. Hence why the burst skill damage buff does not apply. The buff also does not apply to Rupee's burst, and the most likely reason for this is the skill condition. Rupee's burst will actually affect all enemies within attack range, so the game doesn't count this as an attack to a single enemy, even if you're only hitting a single target. So you can expect any other burst that works the same way to not be affected by JACKAL's buff. Now when it comes to characters like Laplace, Modernia, and Sugar, some of you might be wondering if JACKAL's burst will work on them because the skill description says increase burst skill damage to a single enemy. So JACKAL's buff should work as long as you are hitting the same enemy, right? Well, that is actually not the case. It's basically the same reason why it won't work on Snow White and Maxwell. Whenever Laplace, Sugar, or Modernia uses their burst, the attacks during their burst will count as a normal attack, so it will not be affected by JACKAL's buff. One more thing to keep in mind is that the burst skills that hit multiple enemies at a time will not be affected by this buff. So you are looking at characters like Harand and Privity. Their bursts are totally not affected by the buff, not even increasing the damage to just one of the enemies that has been hit. It will take forever for me to cover every single character in this video, so I will probably just make a follow-up video covering all the skills that work with JACKAL's buff. Or maybe I'll just do a document and put a link in the description below. Hopefully I summed it up pretty well, but if you have any more questions about JACKAL's burst, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. And now let's move on to the second part of her burst. On top of the very complicated burst skill damage buff, this will also increase your team's defense by 14.69%. The defense increase from this ability, or any skill in general, is quite insignificant simply because of how the damage is calculated in this game. Without going into too much detail and making things more complicated, the main thing you should know is that the defense increase buff is only really useful for small instances of damage. Once the enemy starts to deal bigger damage numbers, you would rather have an attack damage debuff applied to your enemies, or preferably a shield to negate the incoming damage. So unlike the first part of JACKAL's burst, the defense increase from this is pretty negligible. Moving on to her skill 1, Happy Jackal. This will increase the damage taken and lower the attack for one of your enemies with the highest max HP, and this is activated after getting attacked 10 times. During my testing, I could not get this ability to trigger. The skill should pop up on the left side of the screen to let you know that the skill is activated, but my characters already got hit way more than 10 times and the skill is still not getting triggered. Also considering that this has an effect that applies to the enemies, it is very hard to tell that the skill effect actually works because there is no visual indicator. So right now, I will consider her skill 1 to be bugged and I will just leave updates about it, if any, in the pinned comment or description below. But if this actually works as intended, this will sync very well with her skill 2. During my pre-release analysis, I mentioned that the skill condition from her skill 1 is pretty bad because it's very hard for JACKAL to get hit 10 times. But now because of how her skill 2 works, it's a lot easier to trigger her skill 1. Her skill 2, Jumping Jackal Flash, activates at the start of the battle. This will affect JACKAL and 2 of her allies with the highest attack, and this will share the damage between those characters for 2 minutes, as well as increasing their defense by 8.27% at level 10. What this means is that every single hit towards the affected allies will also count as a hit toward JACKAL, making it way easier to trigger her skill 1. Overall, her skill 1 and 2 have really good synergy, but unfortunately, her skill 1 seems to be bugged. and just like I mentioned earlier, the defense increase is pretty negligible, so I would have preferred to have literally any other skill effect, maybe aside from the enemy attack debuff. Before we move on to her teams, I want to quickly talk about her normal attack and energy generation. JACKAL has a 65.02% scaling on her normal attack, which is actually the highest, on par with Anise. This is good to know because she will be dealing slightly more damage compared to the other rocket launcher users. The next part I want to bring up is energy generation. This is basically how much she fills up the burst meter with her attacks. She has 355 base energy, so this makes her a great energy support, especially if you don't have characters like Senti. With that being said, let's now move on to her best character synergies and team compositions. As we've talked about in this video, JACKAL is a character that is somewhat limited by the fact that her burst skill damage buff only works on specific characters. So in some situations, it might be more optimal for you to use other units if you are only after the damage buff. Because if the damage buff will not apply to most of your units, especially for your main DPS, you're only getting the benefits from JACKAL's skill 1 and skill 2, which is not a lot of utility compared to the other burst 1 units. So if you do decide to use JACKAL, you really have to make sure that at the very least, your burst 3 units actually benefit from JACKAL's buff. Now when it comes to her best character synergies, the main character I want to highlight is Emma. Pairing her with JACKAL is actually very strong just because of how Emma's skill 1 works. Her skill 1 basically has a 5% chance of healing your team based on Emma's maximum HP. In combination with JACKAL's skill 2, this means that every time the characters affected by JACKAL's skill 2 takes damage, they will be sharing damage to Emma, increasing the chances of her activating her skill 1. I have tried this out for both PvP and PvE, and based on my testing, this composition is more viable in PvP. You can technically make this work for PvE, but the healing is less consistent because the enemies are not focused on your units with the JACKAL skill 2 effect. For my testing, I went for a team that consists of Privity, JACKAL, Emma, Senti, and Rapunzel. But feel free to switch out any of the characters in this team composition. Just keep in mind that for PvP, you need to have your DPS character on the first slot, and you preferably need another healer aside from Emma. The reason why you would want to put the main DPS in the first slot is because the shared damage effect from JACKAL will be applied to that unit, and your opponent will always target the unit in the first slot. Now when it comes to how good she actually is compared to the other characters, I will be rating her on a scale of 1 to 10 and explain to you what I think of her as a support for different scenarios. If you want to pull for JACKAL for PvE, she is kind of hard to recommend, just because there are a lot of other Burst 1 units who are on the same level, if not better than JACKAL. Not to mention that they also have more flexibility and comparison. The two main characters I want to bring up are N102 and Litter. Despite being an SR unit, I would actually consider N102 to be a better unit than JACKAL, just because the attack percent bonus from her burst is a flat out damage increase that can literally benefit anyone. And as we've talked about in this video, one of the biggest downsides of JACKAL is that her burst skill damage buff only works on specific units, making her less flexible. And of course we have Litter. She is still on top of the meta just because she has very strong utility and I don't see her getting dethroned anytime soon. Also when it comes to damage amplification, something JACKAL is mainly used for, Litter is still a better option in that scenario. So overall, I would give JACKAL a 6.5 out of 10. She is a very niche support that can give specific characters a really good damage increase, and she can also provide better survivability for your main DPS by taking some of the damage. I would say that the main reason you would want to pull for her is if you're pushing hard on the special arena. JACKAL is a really good option for one of your teams, and with the right characters like Emma, she can perform really well. But for the low spenders or free to play, I really don't recommend going for characters just because they're good for PvP. Because to be honest, the PvP rewards are not that great, so it doesn't really justify pulling for a character specifically for that. So if you are a bit tight on resources, I would say that JACKAL is an easy skip. I would also say that you could maybe do 10 or 20 pulls just to see if you can snipe her so that you have a new character. But I highly suggest that you don't spend your golden mileage tickets on her. With that being said, that is about everything you need to know about JACKAL. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. Also don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.